今天您将收看的是，
他是导演、摄影师、作家、艺术家，他用实验性的电影语言在影史上留下恢宏一笔。今晚我们看电影，一起走进马其顿裔导演米尔科·曼彻夫斯基的光影世界。
大家好，观众朋友们，您现在看到的是今晚我们看电影。马其顿的电影大师曼彻夫斯基是第20届上海国际电影节主竞赛单元的评委。早在上个世纪的90年代，他就以一部《暴雨将至》震惊了整个电影界。那在今天的节目当中，我们就请这位大师做客我们节目，聊一聊他的电影哲学。
第20届上海国际电影节金爵奖评委之一米尔科·曼彻夫斯基出生于1959年，是一位来自美国纽约的马其顿裔电影导演、作家、摄影师和艺术家。他在电影处女作《暴雨将至》中运用了3段式叙事手法，打破了传统叙事模式，是采用后现代叙事文本的电影范例之一。在1994年的威尼斯电影节上，《暴雨将至》一举夺得金狮奖。
Telling stories is easy for me. So telling a linear story is boring. I find it boring while making a film. But to be serious about it, I'm interested in experimenting with ways to tell a story and ways to make art. And playing with the structure is one of those ways of being innovative, being creative and experimenting.
《暴雨将至》以3段独立的故事来刻画同一主题，3个故事平行发展，相互影响，共同推进，直至最终结局。曼彻夫斯基以实验性的手法来处理时空与叙事形式，超越现实又植根于马其顿土壤的厚重悲剧，反暴力和反战的主题跃然而出。
Well, I think violence is terrible. Violence is disgusting. It's ugly.I'm scared of violence, and that's the dark side of the human nature. And I think it's important to talk about it, to confront it, not to glorify it, but to ritualize it. And by talking about it, by discussing it, by seeing it, I think we come to terms with what violence means and how to prevent it. And I think the artist, the filmmaker, should be responsible, should approach violence in a realistic way. Violence is ugly, and it should be ugly the way it's portrayed in a film.
暴雨将至有3段情节相对独立的故事，而3段故事都是以死亡结尾。在这片充满暴力和冲突的土地上，冰冷的死亡与灼热的情感注定长久相依，繁衍生息。
I like a good tragedy. I think a good tragedy makes for a good drama, for a good film. And it's just a personal inclination in the work that I do and the stories that I tell. And even though there's death in the film and there's love that falls apart. Ultimately, I think the film is bittersweet. It's a bit of a reflection of a cynical optimist that I am. The film ends on a high note, even though there's a threat of imminent violence everywhere around the main protagonists.
Moss! Martha!
Moss! Moss!
隐喻不仅是电影语言美学的体现，同样也升华着影片的主题。《暴雨将至》中这样的隐喻存在于台词、构图与用光之中。导演借由这些隐喻来激发观众的共鸣， 也寻找着那种令人感动而遥远的相似性。
Well, I like contrasts, and I like combining elements that seem as if they don't go together. So in my most recent film that has been released, Mothers, I combine fiction with a documentary, which is not something you often do in a film. In Before the Rain and in Dust, I combine countries and periods that usually don't go together. So, to answer your question, in Before the Rain, there's London and then there's the Macedonian mountains, two locations that you think would not go together. But by putting them together, I draw parallels and contrasts. And ultimately, we come to a conclusion that people are the same everywhere. People have similar kind of hopes and they love in a similar way or they're sad in a similar way.
时间不是，圆圈不圆，三个故事平行发展。年轻僧人收留逃亡少女，名摄影师女友怀孕，摄影师回到马其顿老家，三个片段相互影响，推向震撼性结局。叙事体上的回环结构象征了巴尔干半岛连绵不绝的战事。
The reason I wrote the line was just to reinforce, to emphasize the structure of the film. And the structure of the film is circular with a quirk, with a twist, with a bend. It's like an optical illusion in time, like an Escher drawing in time. So the reason the line is there is just to make it clear to the audience that what they're watching and what they're perceiving as an imperfect circle is indeed the filmmaker's intention.
Čevrne, kasat mujt. Ajde. Vreme. Doluje Čevrne. Znači, kire, naši obnove tičnije ravnoprave. Mirisala dožd. Štom zagrmi. Me presekuva. Pomisluvam i kaj nas zapukao. Poleka me, tete. Vreme to nikoga što si umira, a i krugot nije trkalez.
Before the Rain is not a documentary about what was going on in Macedonia, or it's not a documentary about what was going on in what used to be Yugoslavia. It's a piece of fiction, and as such, it speaks of a higher truth than what the actual events on the ground were. I believe that the actual events need to be reported by journalists, by historians, by anthropologists. And the artist needs to speak of higher truth, something that hopefully every human being can relate to, rather than telling of specific events and specific place in the world.
如果说画面是一部电影的直观外在，那么音乐和音效则可能是贯穿整部作品的灵魂。暴雨将至中富含民族性的音乐，仿佛这片土地的悠远叹息，而若即若离的音效设置更丰满了人物的形象与内在。
Well, I mean, film is a complex piece, and there's a whole bunch of elements. It's the story, it's the acting, it's the visuals, and obviously it's the sound and the music. I used a lot of subliminal sounds in both films, things that are not obvious and that are incongruous. For example, whenever you see the girl, Zamira, we hear the sound of a cat in the background, even though we don't see the cat. Or whenever you see, very often when you see Alexander the photographer, you hear an elephant. And those are leitmotifs. That's as far as the sound. The music is a contemporary interpretation of traditional folk music and Byzantine music, seen through a contemporary prism, both in Before the Rain, in Dust, well, also in Shadows and Mothers, my other films. I think if one could make a film without music, it would be really difficult. But if it works, then I think it would be stronger than a film that has music.
接下来您将收看的是，
除了实验性的电影语言，曼彻夫斯基还是一位多栖艺术家。他的摄影作品同样蕴含与众不同的艺术理念。借第20届上海国际电影节之际，曼彻夫斯基的摄影作品展《梦的五言诗》首次在中国上海举办。在暴雨将至、大获赞誉后的第7年，曼彻夫斯基推出了他的又一部作品《尘土》，力求在叙事技巧再续突破。在影片中，观众看到了一个双主线、时空交错且黑白与彩色画面并用的故事。曼彻夫斯基也愈发显示出建构精巧复杂叙事结构的能力。
Well, to her, it's a lifeline. The motto of the film is, where does your voice go when you're no more? And she senses that she's about to die. She's very old. I think we all want to tell stories. We all need to tell stories. We love telling stories. That makes us feel alive, and it makes us feel as if we are part of the community. So it's part of our DNA. The need to tell stories and to hear stories.
Prima non erano 20.
Sta zitto, non mi interrompere.
Prima hai detto che ce n'erano 20 di arabi addosso allo stronzo.
La storia è mia e la racconto come mi pare. Se voglio dico 2000. E poi non erano arabi, erano turchi.
No, scusa, fammi capire, perché cazzo l'ascolto questa storia e cosa cazzo c'entra con te?
Così saprai dove cazzo seppellirlo.
Sì, beata te. Lo vedi questo? Seppelliranno prima me, cazzo.
Chiama gli sbirri. Pollicino.
Ma non prendermi per il culo!
Anche tu puoi dire la tua. Preferisci 20? 20 vanno benissimo. Un pignolo creativo e un controsenso vivente. Erano 20.
Dust deals with different ways of telling a story. It could be a family history, it could be a legend, a myth, it could be real history, it could be a joke, could be an anecdote, could be a lie, that's also telling a story. And the Western myth was part of myself when I was growing up on the comic books and on the Western movies, but also it's part of the cultural heritage of the world. So in dealing with myths, dealing with the myth of the cowboy, of the Western, was pretty important, was pretty essential. Dust plays with those elements. It questions, it juxtaposes the myth versus the actual fact versus history.
尘土以西部片的外观包装起巴尔干民族的苦难神话，是曼彻夫斯基对本民族沉重社会现实所做出的又一次深切反思。他以影像表达对暴力、民族、家庭乃至整个人类生存境遇的思考与忧虑，更再度强调了一名电影人的责任感。
I think that the violence I mean, there is some violence in Dust, but it's nothing compared to a lot of other mainstream films. So I think the audience is fortunately or unfortunately used to to seeing violence in the films. I mean, you can look at the violence in Saving Private Ryan by Spielberg, for example, and Dust is a child's play compared to it. But I think it's important for a responsible, for a serious filmmaker, not to manipulate violence, not to use it, not to trivialize it. I think it's much more dangerous when you see dozens or hundreds of people just being shot and discarded easily with a smirk, with a joke, than seeing the pain of a person dying for hours and pissing in his pants and vomiting while he or she is dying. I think that's the responsible thing to do when dealing with violence. Film and photography are sort of similar but very different at the same time, and that's another element of contrast that I bring into the films. It's not something I do consciously, it just seems to work well, using a photographer and using photography and a character who deals with photography a lot. And then once intuitively it feels right, once I start working with it, I often realize that they're echoes, they're reflections of using such a motif, and then I amplify them and use them much more. Photography, for example, is different from film in that it captures the moment, and that the viewer is in charge of how long it would take to absorb the photograph, while with film, it's the director who decides how long the shot is. It could be rapid, it could be very slow. So in a way, photography is more democratic towards the viewer. And I like introducing that aspect, as well as the aspect of freezing a moment of history for future generations to contemplate.
米尔科·曼彻夫斯基出生在马其顿，在美国纽约学习电影与摄影后，他曾尝试回到马其顿，却找不到任何工作。于是，曼彻夫斯基再次回到纽约，一住就是30多年。如今的他，每年还是会回马其顿一次，但更多的时候，他认为自己是一个纽约人。
Macedonia and I have a complicated relationship. I've lived in New York all of my adult life, but I go back and make films in Macedonia as European co-productions, where I bring most of the money from other countries in Europe to shoot in Macedonia. So part of it is nostalgia, part of it is the fact that I like being there and seeing people, good friends, and going back to my old house and seeing images that I recognize. But I would say that my films are films from Macedonia rather than about Macedonia. And this last film that I just did, I shot it in New York, and it's a film from New York. Well, professionally, it just doesn't offer much opportunity. It's also that I feel as a New Yorker. I spent all my adult life, I wouldn't say American, but I would say a New Yorker.
除了实验性的电影语言，曼彻夫斯基还是一位多栖艺术家。他的摄影作品同样蕴含与众不同的艺术理念。借第20届上海国际电影节之际，曼彻夫斯基的摄影作品展《梦的五言诗》首次在中国上海举办。
In my photography, the framing and the content of the photographs it takes a little bit longer for it to sink in. There's more humor. I use different kind of lenses. I usually go with wider lenses in my photography, and on film I prefer longer lenses, working more on telephoto. I think that on film often you don't have the luxury of time to contemplate the frame in the same way you would in a photograph. So I work with that. What's great about photography for me is that you don't have to explain anything. You just take the picture. If it works, there's a little work of art. If it doesn't, you just forget it. With film, you have to explain every step of the way hundreds and hundreds of times just to get it financed, to communicate to the director of photography or to the editor or to the actor or to the composer. So there's way too much talking when you're making a film, and art often needs silence. It's only me and the camera.
展览标题《梦的五言诗》中的梦，借由曼彻夫斯基对艺术的反思开始，打碎了正常的时间与空间概念，将被创造与被消费两大概念转化为如梦一场的喜悦、苦难和冲突。五言诗取自中国传统诗歌形式五言绝句，富于变化的句式体现着节奏与韵律，正与曼彻夫斯基五福一组的作品灵魂暗合。
曼彻夫斯基身居纽约，现在他也是一位出色的摄影师。好，感谢各位收看我们今天的节目，让我们下一次再见。
明天您将收看的是
曾2获戛纳金棕榈大奖、揽得奥斯卡与金球奖最佳外语片的丹麦导演比利·奥古斯特，带来他第一部拍摄于中国的作品《烽火芳菲》。